Hello and welcome to today's session on public engagement with science. I'm Dr. Katie Stouffer of the University of Florida's Department of Agricultural Education and Communication, where I serve as a research assistant professor and a state extension specialist in STEM education and outreach, where STEM is science, technology, engineering, and math. I'm excited today to talk with you about public engagement, how I see that definition, and how I think it can help you all do better work with communities beyond your traditional scientific circles. I wanted to start with telling you a little bit about my background and how I got to do the work that I do today. I started out in basic neuroscience, where I studied at Caltech kind of the cellular level of how people, how their brains changed as they were learning. So as different molecules in the brain were turned on or turned off. And it was really through my initial work in a post-baccalaureate lab where I was studying functional magnetic resonance imaging with how people were, activating areas in their brain as they did various things. That was my first chance actually to practice this so-called public engagement with science. So during Brain Awareness Week, I actually went to a local museum and was talking with their regular visitors about the work that we were doing at the university, moving beyond giving just a traditional scientific publication or communication with scientific colleagues. And from there, I actually decided that I wanted to study this and go into this field rather than continue doing sort of the basic science research that I was doing. So I went on to get a degree in science journalism. I got a master's degree at Boston University. And during that time, I actually was also working at the Museum of Science in Boston and started to do research with visitors there to understand how they were learning in those contexts. From the journalism degree, I went on to spend a couple of years at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, working in their Earth and Space Science directorates on making public videos for news releases for their Goddard TV and NASA TV and for other TV stations around the country as well as the internet. And really about that time, I was fortunate to accept a position as an informal science educator at the Maryland Science Center, where I actually was working with an Earth Science News exhibit, where instead of offering just a topic-based exhibit, we were really talking with people about science news that was happening every day. We got to cover such events as the Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004, Hurricane Katrina in 2005, several Florida hurricanes in 2004 and 2005, and all sorts of things about the Chesapeake Bay and local water quality and stuff like that. And again, I got to do a little bit of research there with visitors on how they were learning in that setting. And that's really where I ultimately ended up getting a PhD in what we call free choice learning, which is science education with an emphasis on audiences outside of traditional classrooms. So that really brought home a chance for me to combine this research on learning and actually the practice of this public engagement with science. So throughout my PhD work at Oregon State University, and now here as a research professor and extension specialist at the University of Florida, I have been designing new models of public engagement, testing them out with people, and doing other fundamental background research as to how people learn and want to learn when they are beyond the classroom, as we say. So in talking about what public engagement in science is, I want to start with what is science, right? We don't often step back and think about, we all have this conception from working with it, but if we're going to talk to people that maybe don't have the same conception of science that we do, maybe thinking about where our definition is to start with can help us out. Now, it's surprisingly hard to find a definition of science from government agencies or things like that, but I found one from the North Carolina State University Office of Science, or Public Science. And they say science is a way of knowing and investigating the world. So not only this knowledge that you see with the guy on the left, all about the concepts and things that we learn, but also the practice of investigation. And it's kind of this latter thing with the magnifying glass that I think gets overlooked sometimes in our thoughts about public engagement. And even just talking about science with people in general. In traditional formal schools, we spend a lot of time traditionally, historically emphasizing just knowledge, that's moving more to incorporate the practices of science. But if you think about a lot of people out in the world today, they probably just think about science as a collection of facts. Okay, so now let's talk about the other parts of this. Science education, science communication. Why do I call it public engagement with science? Okay, so I feel ultimately that, we're kind of working in a collection of all of these kind of concepts, but why do I think one is not actually sufficient? So science communication, for example, is the process of transmitting information and common understanding from one person to another, okay? So sharing knowledge, sharing that understanding, making that guy have the exclamation points in the icon from the previous slide. Whereas education, on the other hand, defines itself as organized and sustained communication designed to bring about learning. So communication there requires the relation between two or more persons involving the transfer of information, which could be messages, ideas, knowledge, or strategies, right? So already we're seeing that these two are not really separate fields. So in fact, again, you might think about communication sort of this one way, let's send it out there, but communication is trying to share understanding. So there's got to be another person in that part of the equation. Okay, so they've both traditionally, again, focused on knowledge, especially, like I said, then adding that into science as conceptualized as knowledge. We've got to move to a more modern understanding. And so these days, they actually both cover a much broader array of ideas. So we start with the cognitive ideas, the science concepts, absolutely, but also the practices, right? So what kinds of things are people doing? Or what kinds of things do people, learn as a skill or a practice within their discipline? There's also affective, how do people think and feel? And finally, behavioral is another big one, actually promoting changes in action, okay? So as scientists who might want to share our work with the broader world, it's okay. And one fundamental thing is sharing that fundamental knowledge, but we also have to start sharing how we arrived at that knowledge, what the practice of science is. And, people may in the US have a generally high level of trust and a good thought about science, but if you get down into some nitty-gritty issues, there's a little less trust among people, and more skepticism is growing, especially as we've seen, with the rise of internet communicators and problems with the spread of fake news and bots and automated things that are just spreading faster than humans can do it themselves. And finally, ultimately, a lot of scientists would like to see either more people going into science, so diversifying and growing the fields of science, or having people take action in their communities or in their own lives that helps their own health, their own well-being, or the well-being of the communities around them, using the scientific understanding that we've arrived at so far. So that's where we might be interested in sharing and encouraging changes in action. But frankly, these traditions of education and communication have historically been socially separate. Despite these definitions we just kind of talked about, they have different journals, they have different conferences. At UF, I'm here in the middle in the Department of Agricultural Education and Communication in the College of Agriculture. But we also have a College of Journalism and a College of Education. So all three of us are kind of working in very different structures within the university, which makes it at most difficult, if not nearly impossible, to collaborate. And also because we're publishing and talking in different conferences, we may miss some of the work that's really relevant from other parts of the field if we're not careful. And that also means that we might have different stated goals, audiences, settings, sometimes methods. Again, if we miss these, we're kind of missing out on some opportunities. And they might also operate under different theories of exchange. So what is it that people want out of an education experience, for example, versus a communication experience? So education works from theories of how people think and learn. So again, we're trying to study what we can do to build on their prior knowledge and their prior experiences, and how to frame our lessons and things and our communications to help people make those changes. Whereas communication is often looked at from theories of what people expect and what they want to get out of an exchange. So from both sides of it, what does the communicator want and what does the communicatee, or the other side of that exchange, want? So what do they value and what are they looking for in an experience? And that can set up our research questions and ultimately our recommendations in slightly different frames as well. But in reality, I see that these are two sides of the same coin. So communicators are wanting to exchange information in order to facilitate this learning and behavior change, whereas educators want to facilitate this change in knowledge and attitude, but we have to use processes of communication and exchanging information in order to facilitate that change, right? So again, we're starting sort of in different places, ending up maybe in different places, but overall the picture is very similar. So how do we take these from these definitions, which, okay, we kind of understand in a traditional classroom setting, or, very, kind of media communication setting, and how do we think about what we mean more broadly when we're talking about these processes happening in the public sphere? So this is really the crux of this part of the presentation, why I use the phrase public engagement with science. So I want you all to stop and take a moment to think about words and phrases that you might use to describe science education and communication outside of that formal United States K through 12 or K through college classroom setting. What do you think you might use to describe what's happening? Also think about why those are good descriptions of what you do and what your goals are, and what might be problematic about those terms. So take some time at the end of this video, post your thoughts to the discussion forum or share your thoughts with colleagues before we return to the next section and talk more about this idea of public engagement with science.